All right, Jay's Analysis subscribers. The professor is in, and he's got these new hipster glasses that make me look smart. And if I'm going to lecture on tragedy and hope, I got to wear a costume to increase the facade of being intellectual, smart, brain power, nerd goggles. Now, so where were we? Well, we left off with World War II. That's right where we're at. We talked about Cliveden set. We talked about bankers. We talked about Nazis, Rothschilds. Let's see, we're on page 2 here. All of you out there, my good little students, grab your notebooks, take some notes. You're going to learn. And thank you to Jay's Analysis subscribers and readers, because you bitched and harassed enough that I finally got a good computer, and there's this fancy thing here that will also record things in the future, and I think that that's the next course to take in promoting Jay's Analysis. So definitely going to step things up, take it to the next level, get crazy hype, yo. We talked about Bilderberg. Here we go. We mentioned FDR. That's what we did. We did FDR taking over, pretty much handing everything over to the bankers, the whole socialist scam of FDR. And we concluded with the chapter that Quigley talked about, with how the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the end of the Russian Eastern Empire in the Western view, and the end of fascism constitutes the end of all of the classical world and the institution of the success of liberal democracy. So this is where we're at. This also ties in well with the interview that I did with Alexander Dugin. As I said last time, if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend you go watch that, because it's exactly what Quigley's talking about. He's talking about this shift, the European shift that he talked about in chapter 1, away from anything to do with medieval, anything to do with ancient conceptions of the world, and how that all collapses away into the scientific rationalistic world. And last time we read the chapter from Quigley that dealt with scientism, rationalism, and the technocratic era that was coming. So we're gonna stick with this and talk about Japan is the next place. So Japan will of course factor heavily into this situation with World War II. So what's great about this section in Quigley on Japan is that by the 40s, as we saw with many other countries in Europe, it's not any different as we move over into Asia. Quigley says that, by 1927, Japan was controlled by 8 families. Talk about economic ninjas. I mean, 75% of the economy was controlled by 8 families by 1930, he says here, and this is page 564. So what is insightful here is that, as I've mentioned in interviews with Tim Kelly, if you haven't heard the Tragedy and Hope Tim Kelly interviews, go watch those. All of their actions were in the name of the emperor. The emperor was a front piece, Obama, and the emperor acted in the name, or acted as a front piece, just like Federal Reserve banks are a front to the private banks. The emperor acted on the behalf of these monopoly companies. Now, who are the names of these corporations? Well, they're monopoly capitalists, he says, and they were, as we have indicated, the 8 great economic complexes that control family units, cartels known as Zaibatsu. These 8 controlled 75% of the nation's corporate wealth by 1930 and were headed by, listen, Mitsubishi. Interesting. Mitsui, which would later become Mitsubishi. They smashed together a smaller competitor, Suzuki, And this is who runs the country with the emperor as the front. So don't ever fall into the mistake of thinking that all of these that it's a different situation across the globe. It's the same situation of cartels that will use government or Federal Reserve as a front behind which, either through private banking or private monopolistic corporations, they will actually control the entire economy. And even if you only have 75% of the economy, that's enough to control the entire economy. And then you might have amongst these 8 or so ninja cartels take out competitors. And then that will, over time, be centralized. Power and control be centralized. And that's what we saw in the chapter with France and the Rothschilds, right? So then he talks about China, and this is interesting because there's a move in China to become pro-Western, and this is headed up by a character by the name of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was a Mason. Now, that's not what you're told by Quigley, but he says that China's, the Kuomintang details were a mixture of, this is the Sun Yat-sen program, founded by Sun Yat-sen. And their program was a mix of Western, Chinese, and Bolshevik Russian philosophy. Bolshevism is actually a British export, according to Sutton. It's not native to Russia. They sought to achieve a unified and independent China with a democratic government and a mixed cooperative socialism and individualistic economic system. Dr. Sun Yat-sen went to China's own traditions to craft his own cultural ideals, Western and largely Anglo-American traditions for his politics, and then a mixture of socialism for his economic ideas. And guess who is a member of this movement in the early days? Chiang Kai-shek. Now, so you have this democratization, the liberalization, right? This is, we're supposed to think, is the great savior of the world. This is what we've been critiquing throughout Quigley's apologetic. Now, this program was followed by a stage 1 and a stage 2. The stage 2 was reached with the announcement of the Kuomintang to be the sole political party. So they got rid of the fake 2 parties, 3 parties, only the Kuomintang, and they sought to support, under Dr. Sun Yat-sen's influences, Communist International and the Leninist idea of ridding the world of capitalist imperialism. Now, Quigley doesn't mention this here, but keep in mind that we know from other writings that like as I mentioned, Anthony Sutton's books, Wall Street funding Hitler and funding the Bolsheviks, this is a scam, right? Now, what's in the background of that? How is this happening? Who is the famous Freemason in China? Sun Yat-sen. So the Masonic lodges functioned as a network, a means by which the propagation of ideas could be had. Where's the center of world Freemasonry? London. London exports its Anglo-liberal philosophy, democracy, to the rest of the world. But it's a scam. It's never been real. Plato said back thousands of years ago in the Republic, as I did explain in my Republic lectures, democracy is a scam and it's a cloak for oligarchs, right? But it tends to motivate masses into buying into the scam, right? Because they think it's about the people and you get a right to vote. And come on, what did we just see with the DNC and the emails? Voting is a joke, right? What does Mark Twain say? If voting changed anything, they wouldn't let us do it. Exactly. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, as he rose to power, achieved military success in the area and wars that he fought. He had a socially conservative view, but he was also influenced by Sun Yat-sen's democracy and socialism and communism. So, however, over time, Chiang Kai-shek became increasingly conservative, and this culminated in 1927 when he married a member of the wealthy Sung family. And this, I believe, is a prostitution family, according to, I think, Tim Kelly said that. But they're also a Sung banking family. So Chiang Kai-shek marries into the elites, so called, and then Quigley discusses the H.H. Kung, who was similar in economic position, a speculator, and part of this network, this cartel, and it was Sung and Kung who dominated the Kuomintang government. So you have these two banking cartel families that once again dominate the Socialist Democratic Party. Now, how many times have we seen this? At what time does it, what point does it become relevant? Does it become obvious that democracy, socialism, communism, these are means by which bankers run your country? And this is what Quigley is saying explicitly about the Sung, S-O-O-N-G, banking family tied into the Kung economic cartel. So in 1927, communist collaboration was ended with the Kuomintang, and the Russians were expelled from China. The Kuomintang became the only party, and Moscow trained leaders like Mao Zedong concentrated their strength in the southern rural areas where they established themselves as agrarian and communists. And soon the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek completed the conquest of northern China with the capture of Peking. And this shifted after an attempt to then destroy the communists down south in Jiangxi. I believe that's in the south. Anyway, so now we're having this battle between China and Japan, between nationalism, and so down here Chiang Kai-shek, nationalism, and Japan, and then you've got up top, you've got the communists, right? So the Japanese seizure of Manchuria happens. In comes the League of Nations. Japan takes Manchuria, and then we have the Pearl Harbor event, right? So that's what's going to lead up to World War II. So Chiang Kai-shek is going to fight the communists under the banner of Chinese nationalism. However, the bankers double-cross you, motherfucker. You get double-crossed because you fell for the banker scam. And Chiang Kai-shek is left out to dry, and the Western elites decide to aid Mao. And this is what we get with, where is it? It's here somewhere. The biography of Wild Bill Donovan. That Wild Bill Donovan is who aided and trained Mao's guerrillas. Now, why was this? Oh, because they wanted to stop the Nazis, right? We're going to stop the Nazis. No, that was a scam. That was ultimately to set up a spy network throughout China, run by the OSS, to run drug networks, and then also to secretly control China, because Mao was a Yale in China. And you can read my article, Western Support for Communism, OSS, CFR, I think is something of that nature. You can find it. Now, that explains background of what's happening leading up to World War II in the Asia region. So it's also, again, the bankers and their chosen representatives and fronts for the Cliveden set, ultimately. That's who Quigley says is running this, the Anglophile network. Now, the OSS, we know, was set up by Bill Donovan, who was trained and coerced by William Stevenson, Intrepid, and the other British intelligence agents. And that would allow the British to have their hand back in U.S. foreign policy, bringing them into World War II, right? And that is explained in detail in not Peter Wright, Peter Knightley's book on British intelligence, and Craig Cobble's book as well. So I've cited that in my article on Christopher Lee in the novel turned into a book, The Devil Rides Out. So if you read my Devil Rides Out article, you'll find my quotations and citations from those two books that explain how Donovan was coerced by British intelligence to convince the existing U.S. government to participate in the war and to set up the OSS, which would become the CIA, to control the drug networks. Come on, right? That's what this is really about. It's controlling the flows of black markets and geostrategy. That's what this is really about. So Italy had limited national resources. Quigley argues they couldn't be that much of a force in World War II, but they did play a role. Russia was admitted to the League of Nations in 1934. Interesting. So after the exportation of Bolshevism, oh, now you can come on to our global banking One World Order committee, now that Bolshevism has ruined your nation. And what did the British do in the Suez Canal? Now, this is important because this is going to play a role in geostrategy and warfare, is controlling the Suez Canal. So the League of Nations puts sanctions on Italy, and this causes reaction on the part of Italy from the Mussolini government, if I recall. But here's what's neat. The British denounced the peace ballot and the collective security basis, blah, 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 and institute a dual policy where they're going to try to appease both sides of this League of Nations peace treaty, whatever, in 1934. I believe that's what, 1935. The League of Nations peace deal in 1935. Britain's trying to play a dual policy of both sides. That's because Britain is very much engaged in the background of organizing World War II. So that's the dual policy here. Now, the British obtained the Suez Canal by Rothschild money. That's what's neat. And this is a big factor in what will lead to World War II. And Quigley will even talk about that. Now, Quigley says the British didn't want peace. This was a facade. The Atlantic Organization, including the dominions of the United States, Britain insisted on sanctions against Italy, but the British government never wanted security to be a success. As a result, the French desire for no sanctions combined with the British desire for ineffective sanctions to provide ineffective sanctions. I don't know what Quigley's saying there, but because there were sanctions, France lost Italian support against Germany. So we see that the pieces are starting to fall into place because of British background machinations. And that's what's very important here. Now, Lord Curzon is one of these key figures in the roundtable groups and in the Cliveden set. And Lord Curzon, with the Astors, is going to be involved in establishing at this point the Royal Institute for in the 20s, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House, and through those networks is what I'm trying to say. They're going to promote the propaganda that's going to lead to World War II. And so the British plans and motives are in reaction to these to the dual policy that is leading up to the war. So he says in the earlier period, the chief figures of the group were Lord Curzon, that is in the World War II period, and then General Smuts, British General Smuts. They did what they could to destroy the reparations and to permit German rearmament and to tear down what they called French militarism. The point of view was supported by the second group, which was known in those days as the Roundtable Group. It came together to later to be called the Cliveden Set, after the country estate of Lord and Lady Astor. It included Lord Milner, Leopold Amory, Lord Altrincham, Lord Lothian, Lord Smuts, Lord Astor, Lord Brand, Lionel Curtis, Geoffrey Dawson, and editors of the big publications, The Times, their associates. And this group wielded influence because it controlled the Rhodes Trust. Now, the Bate Trust and the Times of London and the Observer were all under the influence of a quarterly review known as the Round Table. Founded in 1910 with money supplied by Sir Abe Bailey and the Rhodes Trust, this would eventually become RIIA, Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Chatham House. All right, now, this roundtable group formed the core of the three block supporters. They differed from anti-Bolshevists, right? Because they like Bolshevism. And they did not want to destroy Bolshevism. There you go. The Cliveden set, Royal Institute for International Affairs, did not want to destroy Bolshevism. Why? Because it was a great weapon to destroy Russia. Now, let's talk about Roundtable Chatham Chairman. This makes up the Atlanticists' power block. This is the top of the pyramid in the West. And after this period, this top of the pyramid just simply includes the American elite, right? So take Royal Institute for International Affairs, Royal Society, these groups, smash into it the National Security Council and the Pentagon and those groups, Federal Reserve and all that. That's the top of the pyramid. That's who runs this whole scam. The more moderate roundtable groups, Lord Milner, Lord Lothian, Lord Brand, blah, 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 wanted a weaker League of Nations, and, yeah, right, in order to strengthen Germany, only because they wanted World War II to happen, not because they actually didn't like the United Nations or the League of Nations. They helped create those things. But they wanted it to not really dominate and control German or British foreign policy. They only wanted it to be a kind of placeholder, be weak at times, and then maybe later down the road have it be stronger, because, again, ultimately the goal is world government, as Quigley says in the book about this group. So the Atlantic Bloc is what it's called. These are the Atlanticists, and they are the Royal Institute for International Affairs, roundtable groups. Lord Milner was the head of the Rhodes Scholarship from 1905 to 1925. Lord Lothian was the secretary to 1925 and 1940. Through the roundtable groups, which had been set up in the United States, India, and the British Dominions, all throughout 1910 and 1917, through the Chatham House, which set up the RIIA, and the CFR. And the CFR in the U.S., in New York, in the 20s. As well as the Institute for Pacific Relations. We know that the Rockefellers played heavily into that, the IPR, and various countries as autonomous branches of the RIIA. This influential group sought to change the League of Nations from an instrument of collective security, into non-political matters like drug control and international postal services. In other words, running the black markets. To rebuild Germany, right? They wanted a rebuilt Germany, is what Quigley's saying here. Now they want to. Why would they want that? Because they want World War II. Appeased Germany is the plan. Why would you want a plan of appeasement of Germany? So that it can build up, so that you can have the war, and that's the whole point. So Chatham House propaganda puts out simultaneously. Germany is our friend, and Germany is building up for war. So this causes a panic, and Quigley says on page 584 that it's propaganda and it's a lot of fake news. And this is where we get the famous speech, "Peace in our time, peace in our time." Peace in our time, that famous speech, is, according to Quigley, a PsyOp. Now, let's listen and see how that is. So, the peace at any price people were both few and lacking in influence in Britain, and on the contrary, it was true in France. However, the period of August 1935 to March 1939, especially September, the government built upon the fears of this group, steadily exaggerating Germany's armed abilities, and they belittled Britain's own armaments. These were calculated indiscretions, such as that there was no anti-aircraft defense in London, which was not true, but it was fake news. By constantly hammering the danger of the air attack from Germany, and by building ostentatious and quite useless air raid trenches in the streets and in the parks, these were pointless. This had the fear of daily threats, and by mandating that you must wear a gas mask when the government tells you to. It's all fake. Page 584. There was no threat. This was all made up. In this way, the government put London into a panic in 1938 for the first time since 1804 or even 1678. And by this panic, Neville Chamberlain, was able to get the British people to accept the destruction of Czechoslovakia, wrapping it up in a piece of paper marked "Peace in Our Time," which he obtained from Hitler and confided to that ruthless dictator for British public opinion. Once this panic passed, Chamberlain found it was impossible to get the British public to follow his program, although he himself never wavered even into 1940. And by their he could not openly appeal to support for either the anti-Bolsheviks or the three bloc defenders, and he had to adopt the dangerous expedient of pretending to resist while really continuing to make every possible concession to Hitler. So in other words, the front man is having to deal with all the fallout of the ridiculous hypocrisy that he's being forced into by the money power. And what we see that every day in American politics, don't we? Those fall people, the fall men, the front guys, the used car salesmen like Obama or Hillary Clinton, they're there to take all the heat that comes, and then they get replaced every 4 years. Or every 8 years, depending, right? But what's interesting is that it's the UK and the Germany. It's the UK. It's the UK elite, as we've said, who are planning the war to weaken Russia and Germany. So it's a constant pattern of the 20th century of what techniques and methods can be used by the Atlanticists to drive a wedge between and make sure that Germany and Russia can never be an imperial threat to the British. That's the key to the 20th century, and Quigley talks about that at length. But it's also been talked about in previous analyses that we did. So now we're going to move to talk about Spain a little bit, and what's happening with Spain, and how Spain is, according to Quigley, he calls it the liberal, I'm going to call it the liberal tragedy. And I think that's appropriate. So we're doing tragedy and hope. How about liberal tragedy, right? The liberal world order move. Liberal Spain. We're going to talk about liberal Spain and how it went from the course of being part of that older civilization that Quigley criticized as being illiberal, unscientific, and so forth, because, of course, it was Catholic. And so what happens is that over time, Spain, of course, succumbs to a series of invasions. You have Arabs, you have Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and you have modernism that affect Spain, French Revolution as well, Enlightenment. All of this is what transforms Europe. And so Quigley says on 587, the impact of the bourgeois, liberal, scientific, and industrialized West upon Spain was similar to the impact of other backwards political units such as Japan, China, and Turkey. Now, what propaganda here by Quigley, right? And they resisted the political expansion of the West, adopting its industry and its science and its democracy, etc., etc. So in Spain, Russia, and China, this attitude of resistance, he says, was sufficiently successful to delay the process of westernization because it was traditional. What an amazing page here. And so the Spanish tragedy of 1931 to 39 is what he calls this resistance to modernity, this attempt to retain tradition in the face of an overwhelming juggernaut of Masonic liberal democracy. And bourgeois liberalism, he explains, is what comes to take to dominance in Spain, and there's back and forth battles between restoration of the monarchy, defeat of the monarchy, and we get a kind of liberal elite that take over in Spain, and these are the moneyed class, and they come to promote laissez-faire, they come to promote constitutional parliamentarianism, the liberal ideas of economics of the West, private property in a capitalistic sense, anti-bureaucratic freedom, anti-clericalism, and the limitation of the monarchy. Well, that sounds so good, doesn't it? But what does this result in? It results in the complete destruction of traditional Spain. In comes Trotskyism, in comes communism, in comes leftism, and all of these Mongoloid cousins that follow along with democracy. And what we get then is a series of strife, destabilization. We get Carlists versus renovationists in an attempt to restore and retain the Catholic tradition in Spain. The Spanish Liberal Republic of 1931 collapses after 5 years. Alfonso XIII flees to Spain, or excuse me, to France. Republicans take over, and you have a Masonic republic erected in Spain. And this is 1930s. And so what does it do? Well, it brings in religious liberty, a secular government, secular schools, secular libraries, all under the guise of freedom and democracy. And this, of course, causes a counter-reaction, and this is where we get the Mussolini support of the monarchists who want to get rid of the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, what's interesting that I've not found this anywhere else. Only Quigley seems to talk about this, and I mentioned this in other interviews. But the Falange, who are a fascist organization, and they're going to be behind the rise of General Franco. Where is General Franco in this period? One of the chief figures. Now, this is crazy. One of the chief figures in the conspiracy in England was Douglas Jerrold, a well-known editor who has revealed some details in his autobiography. By the end of May 1936, he obtained 50 machine guns and 500,000 rounds of ammunition for his cause. In June, he persuaded Major Hugh Pollard to fly to the Canary Islands in order to transport General Franco by plane to Morocco. Pollard took off on July with his daughter Diana, etc., etc. And on July 15th, the orders were issued by the Italian Air Force to certain units to prepare to fly to Spanish Morocco. So they basically, as soon as Franco reached Morocco from the Canaries, he appealed for these planes through a special emissary to Hitler and through German consul to Tetuan. And so you have basically secret British aid and support to Franco. Now, we saw the British policy of appeasement, and you'll note there that right before this, I played you the clip of Neville Chamberlain in his famous Peace in Our Times speech, which was, of course, propaganda, playing both sides of the game, supporting Hitler, appeasement, meanwhile also running ads through the RIIA publications and articles that said that Hitler was building up for war, which was propaganda, but it was propaganda that was designed to get the British into the notion of getting ready for war, while they were simultaneously running PsyOps and telling people that there were trenches out in the streets and drilling people with gas mask scenarios, which was not true. This was not being planned by Germany, but this appeasement plan was intended to stoke the fears of the people, right? So in other words, Neville Chamberlain was appearing to be weak because he was appeasing Germany, while at the same time the establishment was running these stories about how Germany was preparing for war. So what did this make everybody do in England? Well, they freaked out and they said, this Neville Chamberlain guy is a total pussy. He's going to let Hitler attack us. The nuke, right? It's the same as the whole idea of stop, drop, and roll under your desk if Russia sets off nukes, right? It makes no sense. What is hiding under a desk going to do with the supposed power of a nuke that like wipes out buildings, right? And that's all PsyOps, that's psychological warfare to train you to basically just be afraid. And it's the same pattern here that we see with the UK government. And so you have the Axis and the secret UK support for Franco. Isn't that interesting? And then Japan and Germany jump on to support Franco. And this is where we start having the great powers align into the Allies and the Axis. Russia, interestingly, had a period of support for Spain in 1936 for various other geopolitical reasons. The threat of the Reds in Spain was exaggerated by the Axis powers. And so what we have is some skirmishes over Aden, Ethiopia, Gibraltar, and India for geostrategic points. These are also, these minor skirmishes are going to play into the setting up the stage for World War II. Now, what's interesting is that Quigley ends the Spain chapter by saying that, so Franco wins, and the UK and France recognized Franco's government in 1939, but this was to get Spain into the war, right? So when the war ended, Quigley says, much of Spain was wrecked. 450,000 Spaniards had been killed. 130,000 rebels were killed. This is the wars in Spain related to the loyalists, to Franco, and to fascism, and to republicanism, and so forth. These Spanish wars, and this resulted in the UK recognizing the Franco government in 1939. But what's interesting is that, could this have been the UK plan to weaken Spain? Because we just read that they flew Franco in, the British intelligence did. And what happened? Spain was wrecked, Quigley says. So Spain is wrecked. They're now part of the Axis powers, which the UK seems to be wanting. They want this giant World War II for the weakening of Russia and Germany ultimately, because we saw Bolshevism weakened Russia and made it more amenable to Western interests. How? Anthony Sutton. Wall Street supports Bolsheviks. Wall Street supports Hitler. And it's the same thing with the fascists here. This, I see London and the Cliveden set in the background wanting this. They want this war, even though they have this public policy of appeasement, which I think has fooled many people into thinking that they didn't. But they did. Because out of giant wars, you get weakened nations. Even though the UK was weakened as an economy as a result of World War I, it's not the UK and its people, it's the elite Astors and so forth at the top of the pyramid. Just like in the US, we go through depressions. It's not the government that suffers, it's not the banking elite, that's who profits. So we're not talking about the population, we're talking about the people at the top who run this thing. Now let's talk about, next we get into what's going on in Germany, different militias that come to power, and these militias will play an important role in the rise of the Nazi Party and the Weimar Republic, and the secret deal that the UK had, this appeasement program that we've been talking about, the secret deal the UK had with the Hitler government, and the lying plans that they have in regard to this dual policy of, on the one hand, claiming to appease Hitler and also promoting in publications the fact that Hitler was arming for war. Next, we move to the period in Austria, which sets the stage for what happens with Germany in World War II. This is Austria 1933 to 38. And Quigley talks about socialism, democracy, anti-clericalism, and anti-religious sentiment. Pacifism, progressivism are what begins to invade Austria as well as the rest of the world, really. And it's because the country was Catholic, it was seen as backwards and belligerent and intolerant. And so once again, we see that the theme of the 20th century is the rise of Western liberalism and so forth. And so to combat this, there's this priest, Monsignor Seipel, and he starts a party for the attempt of the restoration of the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is not feasible because the economic conditions are very bad, and this is as a result of the banking interests in Germany and Austria that lead to austerity, lead to housing problems. And so you have the rise, again, once again, of the liberal world order in the social democratic party that attempts to battle tradition. This leads to displacement of populations, immigration, and the Heimwehr militia is formed to keep immigrants out. And of course, they're portrayed as evil racists, and because they're anti-democratic, they're considered unprogressive. Now, isn't that interesting? Because that's what we're seeing even now in our day in Europe, and this forced migration of immigrants that are a result of NATO policies. So what we have with Syria and populations being moved into Europe, that's the result of NATO and Turkey policy in Syria, with the destruction of Syria. And this is forcing people into other countries, even into other Middle Eastern countries. So the refugee crisis, migrant crisis, is an engineered crisis that's the fault of the Western establishment. And then they play both sides of that by also aiding and abetting the far-right parties in Europe. And so this is a clash, a stoked clash of civilizations. And what's interesting is that we see it all the way back. This is a repeat of what we saw in Austria in the 1930s. And so Quigley says that this is, he doesn't talk about right-wingers being funded by any Western powers, but he does say that the right wing is, he calls them basically evil because they're opposing the new liberal order, right? That's, you have to be evil if you don't oppose the liberal world order. So the right wing reaction, to speak in Elmer Fudd terms, right wing reaction is what destroys the country, according to Quigley on page 612. So of all of the nonsense that the bankers, once again, Quigley admits, are guilty of, he says that it's the reaction to this is what destroys the country. Now, how many times have we seen this? Anytime there's reaction on the part of people who don't like their past, their tradition, their beliefs encroached upon across the globe, whether it's in the Middle East or Russia or wherever, when there's a reaction against this, the establishment says that the reaction is the one who's caused the problems. It's just like in 2008 with the banking crisis. And when this happened, the establishment immediately said that all the people who called it out as a crisis and a fraud and a scam, the establishment said that they were the ones that were at fault. So this is just age-old scam. The system blames the people who might literally or legitimately try to fix things. That's the endless scam. Now we get into the Jewish aspect of the banking in Germany, which Quigley treats, and there's an alliance of Jewish banking interests, of Atlanticist banking powers in Germany, that causes austerity and inflation, 1931 to 1933, and this leads to a reaction on the part of other groups, including Catholics in Germany and Austria. Dollfuss, who was kind of involved in this Heimwehr anti-immigrant party, Christian, German cooperative federal state, Democratic Republic. This constitution was fraudulent and illegal. There was Dollfuss signed a concordat with the Vatican in 1933. Since the Holy See wanted this agreement to be approved by Parliament, Dollfuss decided to kill several birds with one stone by convoking a rump of the Parliament. So we basically had this cycles of overturning government and so forth, who's going to be in power. The cooperative aspect of the new constitution was a complete fraud. In many activities, no corporations were actually set up. When they were set up, the whole banking and industrial system was filled with bureaucrats from the nationalist German front, the Fatherland Front. And because of the mismanagement and world depression, the banks of Austria collapsed in 1931 to 1933. This precipitated a world banking crisis. The Austrian government took over the banks and gradually replaced their personnel and all of the Jews with National Front bankers. Since the banks controlled 90% of the country's industrial corporations, the party hacks, he calls them, were able to place their friends throughout the economic system. By 1934, almost nothing could be done in business without the friends of the government. So this is the 1931 to 33 nationalist right-wing takeover of the banks and the government, in contrast to the Atlantis' bourgeoisie banking internationalist interests. And so this leads to the beer hall putsch, because the Nazis are National Socialist Party at this time, who don't think that the right-wing government is good enough. It needs to be more of a people's workers' party. And so they actually take out Dollfuss, this nationalist leader, and the Nazis come to power, and this leads to crackdowns, this leads to a response on the part of the Nationalist Party to crack down on Nazis, socialists, Catholics, and other militia groups. So you have all these attempts at consolidation of power in Germany at this time by the Fatherland Front Party. This doesn't pan out, of course, never does. And you have what's going to lead to a big part of World War II with the Czechoslovakian crisis, the Czech issue. So that's what we're going to talk about here a little bit in a moment. But before we really delve into that, we're going to talk about the Round Table Group and their 7-point deal with the British. And this is what's a big part of the background of World War II. So basically, Hitler is forced into this position where he has to eventually go for Czechoslovakia, and we'll get into more of that later, but Quigley does mention that in this section. So, but I don't want to get too ahead of things. But in the meantime, the British government, especially the small group controlling the foreign policy, Cliveden said, had reached 7-point plan regard to Hitler and Germany. Hitler Germany was the frontline bulwark against the spread of communism. So the Cliveden argued, yeah, right. A 4-power pact of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany would exclude Russian influence. Supposedly, they thought at this time. Britain had no desire to weaken the axis between Rome and Berlin, but it did regard the Anglo-French Union as the foundation of a stable Europe. Britain had no objection to the German acquisition of Austria and Czechoslovakia and Danzig at this point. So Britain was fine with Germany acquiring Czechoslovakia and Danzig, and this was kind of, I would say, probably a trap, because then it makes Hitler look like the aggressor. And Quigley will go on to call Hitler the aggressor when actually he's fallen into the British plan. Germany must not use force to achieve its aims in Europe, as this would precipitate a war in which Britain would have to intervene because of the pressures of public opinion. In Britain and the French system of alliances, Germany could get away with its aims without using force, and that's again the plan of Peace in Our Time quote that I played earlier from Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain, by the way, is also who's one of the founding fathers of the modern MI6 British intelligence. So that gives you an idea of what kind of character you're dealing with. Britain, this is point 5, wanted an agreement with Germany restricting the number of usage of bombing planes. Britain was prepared to give Germany colonial areas in South Central Africa, including Belgian Congo, Portuguese Angola, only if Germany would renounce its desire to recover Tanganyika, which had been taken from Germany in 1919, and if Germany would sign an international agreement to govern these areas with due regard for the rights of the natives. Oh yeah, British Empire really cares about the rights of the natives, right? And an open door commercial policy, free trade. Britain would use pressure on Czechoslovakia and Poland to negotiate with Germany to be conciliatory towards German ideas, supposedly. To these 7 points, we should add an eighth, that Britain must rearm in order to maintain its position in the three-bloc world and to deter Germany from using force in creating its own bloc in Europe. So UK just mainly wants to make sure that Germany's not going to be a new bloc of power, but they will be for the purpose of destroying them. Now listen to this. This point was supported by Chamberlain, who built up the Air Force, which saved Britain in 1940, and by the Round Table Group. So all of this was organized by the Round Table Group, including Lord Lothian, Lord Gregg, Leopold Amory, and so forth. So we've got these. Now listen to this. This is interesting. In a conversation between Lord Halifax and Hitler in 1938, there was a conversation between Neville Chamberlain and his sister in 1937, a conversation between Hitler, Ribbentrop, and British Ambassador Neville Henderson in 1938, a series of conversations between Lord Halifax, Ribbentrop, and Sir Thomas Inscopp, British Minister of Defense, and so forth and so on. And then Lord Chamberlain's personal representative, they're all just hanging out together, right? Chatting it up. Neville Chamberlain with various American journalists had a meeting at Lord Astor's house in 1938, and these 7 points were mentioned as the plan that Britain would use to go forward in relationship to Nazi Germany. Now, this 7-point deal happens because Ribbentrop, who's Hitler's one of his top military guys, is BFF with the Cliveden set. He's always hanging out, sipping champagne, and I guess, like I said, drinking champagne out of beer steins with the Cliveden set. So really, I guess this is a big debatable point about World War II, and I'm not like an expert on World War II history, but I guess it's a crucial debatable question as to to what degree the UK is in a backdoor deal with Hitler and his crew for World War II. These wild men were encouraged in their attitude by the belief that Britain and France were so decadent that they would stand for anything. So the Germans are considering Britain and France so bourgeois, liberal, decadent that they won't stand for any principles, so they'll be easy to conquer. But never underestimate the power of the propaganda of freedom, right? Now, Quigley deals with this, and he says, their error was based on the fact that the Nazis had no idea of how democratic government works. Give me a break. There is no... This is Quigley, again, propagandizing for democracy. They had no respect for public opinion and a free press. Now, what a hypocrite, because Quigley already said that there was no free press, and the bankers already controlled it. So, I mean, how many times... Quigley's contradicted himself, like, as many pages as there are in Tragedy and Hope. Quigley's contradicted himself that many times. Now, what does he say? Their error, Ribbentrop's association with the Cliveden set, he says, meant that Germany assumed that they had friends, right? But supposedly the Cliveden set, I guess, double-crossed Hitler. In the third place, the British government could not publicly admit to its own people of the 7-point plan with Germany because they were not acceptable to British public opinion. Accordingly, these points had to remain secret except for various trial balloons that they would issue through the Times and in speeches of the House of Commons and in Chatham House and in articles in the Round Table magazine circulated by various groups in order to persuade the British people to accept the 7-point plan of union, peace with Hitler. As they were achieved, the British government spread the tale that Germany was armed to the teeth and that the opposition to Germany was insignificant. This propaganda first appeared in an effusion of Round Table publications and through the group. Lord Lothian had visited Hitler in 1935 and had been pushing the 7-point program in the Times, the Round Table, Chatham House, Lord Halifax in 1937 in the issue of Roundtable magazine. Blah blah blah. So basically, they created a whole bunch of war lies and propaganda. Now that's crucial. So the outcome would be uncertain, but and if you saw the propaganda speech right earlier that we played from Chamberlain, you get the idea. This is interesting. So for years, this is 1938. Before 1938, the government had insisted that British rearming was progressing in a satisfactory fashion. Churchill and others questioned this and produced figures on German rearmament to prove that Britain's own progress was a failure. The figures, which were made up, were denied by the government and their own rearmament defended. As late as 1938, Chamberlain said that British armament were such to make Britain an almost terrifying power in the opinion of the world. But as the year went on, the government adopted quite a different attitude in order to persuade the public that it was necessary to yield to Germany, and the government and its supporters pretended that its armaments were inadequate in comparison with Germany. We now know, thanks to captured papers of the German Ministry of War, this was all exaggerated. From 1936 to 1939, German aircraft production was not raised. The Czech army was better trained, he says, than the Germans. They didn't have that many tanks at this time. And so this was all made up by the Cliveden set. Playing both sides of this. This is crucial. From these facts, it is quite clear that Britain did not yield to superior force in 1938, as was stated at the time, and it's been stated by many historians, including Churchill, whose war memoirs are basically they're not right; they're made up. Chamberlain government knew these facts, but consistently gave a contrary impression that Lord Halifax went so far in the direction to call protests from the military attaches in Prague and Paris. Chamberlain government made it clear to Germany that both publicly and privately they would not oppose Germany's armament progress and projects. As Dirksen wrote to Ribbentrop in 1938, anything that can be got without firing a shot, you can count upon the agreement of the British. Britain would not oppose the annexation of Austria by Hitler, although they continued to warn against excessive force. Ooh. Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons that neither the League of Nations nor Britain could be expected to support an independent Austria, and that Hitler, therefore, take Austria. Who cares? We like that. Why? Well, again, Quigley's not outright going to call it a conspiracy because he's writing for the Cliveden set. That's who he's an apologist for the Anglo-American establishment. So he's not going to outright call it a conspiracy, but wait a minute, we're starting to see that it is a conspiracy. They want a war. This is the plan. This is the Royal Society plan to destroy the existing state of Europe, reorganize it, the long-term plan of the New World Order, basically. So next we're going to talk about the Czechoslovakia crisis, where they kind of forced Hitler to move into the area, and this is what will lead to World War II. So in the second hour, we're going to get into that. And if you've been watching, this is Jay's Analysis. I'm Jay Dyer, and we're talking about Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. So stay with me. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe to my lectures, interviews, podcasts, and talks at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or $60 a year. You can get access to all the archives and everything else that's coming out in the next year. Going to be a lot of awesome, deep stuff, right? So we go into realms that the rest of these people out here don't, right? We're getting really hardcore, a full analysis of the entirety of Tragedy and Hope. So stay tuned for the next hour where we continue with the Czech crisis and the beginning of World War II. And then you can also order my book, Esoteric Hollywood, which is now available for pre-order at Amazon or Trine Day Publishers. Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. Thank you for listening.